July 10, 1976, 12:37 p.m., a Saturday afternoon in northern Italy. The Igmisa chemical plant in Meta, just north of Milan, sits quiet. The workers have gone home for the weekend. Inside reactor B, something is going wrong. A runaway chemical reaction. Temperature rising. Pressure building. No one is there to stop it. At 12:37, a safety valve blows open. A white cloud erupts into the bright summer sky. 6 tons of chemicals blast into the atmosphere. The cloud drifts southeast, carried by the wind, spreading over the countryside. Inside that cloud, sodium hydroxide, ethylene glycol, various industrial chemicals. And something else, something far more dangerous. Approximately 15 to 30 kilograms of TCDD 2, 3, 7, 8 tetrachlorobenzo-P-dioxin, the most toxic synthetic chemical ever created. One of the most potent poisons known to science. The cloud settles over 18 square kilometers of densely populated area. Over homes, schools, farms, playgrounds. Over the town of Seveso and surrounding communities. Over children playing in summer sunshine. Over families eating lunch. Over pregnant women. Over thousands of people who have no idea they've just been poisoned. Hoffmann La Roche, the company that ran the Igmisa plant, only admitted the accident almost 1 week after it had happened. 1 week. 7 days while the poison soaked into soil, into plants, into bodies. 7 days while children played in contaminated yards. 7 days while families ate contaminated food. 7 days of exposure that couldn't be undone. By the time officials finally evacuated the area, thousands of animals in the contaminated area had died and many thousands more were slaughtered to prevent TCDD entering the food chain. The cloud of substances released contained sodium hydroxide, ethylene glycol, sodium trichlorophonate, and approximately 15 to 30 kilograms of TCDD. That amount of TCDD measured in kilograms, not grams, represents the highest residential exposure to dioxin in human history. This is the story of the Seveso disaster. The poison cloud that Europe tried to forget but couldn't, because the victims are still dying, still developing cancers, still passing genetic damage to their children and grandchildren. The industry Chimiche Meta Società Azionaria, Igmisa, chemical plant was owned by Givaudan, a subsidiary of the Swiss pharmaceutical giant Hoffmann La Roche. The plant manufactured trichlorophenol, a chemical used in pesticides and herbicides. The production process was dangerous. Manufacturing trichlorophenol required high temperatures and produced TCDD dioxin as an unwanted byproduct. At normal operating temperatures, TCDD is normally seen only in trace amounts of less than 1 ppm, parts per million. But if the temperature got too high, if the reaction went wrong, dioxin production could spike dramatically. The plant sat in a densely populated area. Zone A had between 736 to 753 residents, with thousands more in surrounding zones. Homes, schools, farms, all within range of the plant. This was normal in 1970s Italy. Industrial plants operated in residential areas with minimal safety buffers. Environmental protection wasn't a priority. Communities lived alongside chemical factories, trusting that authorities and companies would keep them safe. That trust was misplaced. At 12:40 p.m. on July 10, 1976, 6.5 hours after a chemical plant in Seveso, a working-class suburb of Milan, Italy, had closed down for the weekend, a runaway reaction in one of its reactors produced an explosion that blew a safety valve and vented the contents into the atmosphere. The plant had shut down for the weekend. Normal procedure. But inside reactor B, the chemical reaction didn't stop. The production cycle was interrupted without any agitation or cooling, prolonging holding of the reaction mass. Without cooling, without agitation, the temperature inside the reactor climbed. As it climbed, the chemical reaction accelerated. As it accelerated, it produced more heat. A feedback loop. A runaway reaction. The temperature soared. In the higher temperature conditions associated with the runaway reaction, TCDD production reached 166 ppm or more. From trace amounts to 166 parts per million. A massive, catastrophic increase in dioxin production. Pressure built inside the sealed reactor. Finally, the safety valve, designed to prevent explosion, opened. The reactor vented directly into the atmosphere. No filters, no scrubbers, no containment. The reactor relief valve eventually opened, causing the aerial release of 6 tons of chemicals, which settled over 18 square kilometers, 6.9 square miles, of the surrounding area. TCDD dioxin is a known human carcinogen and potent endocrine disruptor. It is highly lipophilic and has a long half-life in humans. Let's break down what that means. Carcinogen causes cancer. Multiple types, lymphomas, soft tissue sarcomas, potentially others. Endocrine disruptor interferes with hormones, affects reproduction, development, thyroid function, immune system. Lipophilic dissolves in fat, not water. Once TCDD enters your body, it accumulates in fat tissue and stays there. Long half-life. Takes years to decades to leave the body. Much of what we know and can learn about the risks of dioxin exposure on human health arose from the tragic circumstances of Seveso. TCDD is invisible, odorless. You can't see it, smell it, taste it. The white cloud that settled over Seveso looked like steam or fog. Nothing obviously dangerous, but this was one of the most toxic substances ever created. Agent Orange, the defoliant used in Vietnam, contained TCDD as a contaminant. That's why Vietnam veterans developed cancers, birth defects in their children, long-term health problems. The TCDD in Agent Orange poisoned them. At Seveso, people were exposed to concentrations far higher than Vietnam veterans ever faced. Hoffmann La Roche, the company that ran the ICMISA plant to produce pesticides, only admitted the accident almost 1 week after it had happened. At least a week passed before a public statement was issued that dioxin had been emitted, and another week passed before an evacuation began. Why the delay? The company didn't want to admit what happened, didn't want the liability, the bad publicity, the costs, so they stayed silent while trying to assess the situation privately. Meanwhile, in Seveso and surrounding towns, people noticed strange things. Plants wilting, leaves turning brown, small animals, birds, rabbits, cats, dying. By that time, the first cases of severe dioxin poisoning had already been reported. A lot of vegetation around the plant had wilted, and thousands of animals had died. Children developed skin conditions, chloracne, a severe form of acne caused specifically by dioxin exposure. Many chloracne cases were diagnosed in Seveso residents, especially in children. But without knowing about the dioxin release, doctors couldn't diagnose it properly. Parents worried their children had some mysterious illness. People ate contaminated food from their gardens. Children played in contaminated soil. 7 days of exposure that would have permanent consequences. When authorities finally acknowledged the dioxin release, they faced a massive crisis. Authorities later estimated on the basis of the soil contamination that between 450 grams and 3 kilograms of TCDD were spread over an area of 249 hectares, inhabited by a population of 5,904 people, of whom 1,835 were children. The contaminated area was divided into zones based on soil dioxin levels. Zone A, TCDD soil concentration of 50 micrograms per square meter, μg/m2, the most contaminated. Immediate evacuation required. Zone B, moderately contaminated. Restrictions on food production, children's activities. Zone R, lower contamination. Monitoring and restrictions. Between July 26th and August 2nd, the 730 inhabitants living in the most polluted zone near the factory, where soil concentrations of dioxin exceeded 0.01 parts per million, were evacuated. Imagine receiving that order. Pack up your family. Leave your home. You can't take most of your possessions, they're contaminated. Your house, your yard, everything you've built, all poisoned. And you can't come back. Not for weeks, months, maybe never. As a consequence, more than 600 people had to be evacuated from their homes, and as many as 2,000 were treated for dioxin poisoning. Thousands of animals in the contaminated area died, and many thousands more were slaughtered to prevent TCDD entering the food chain. This wasn't just wildlife. These were farm animals, pets, livestock that families depended on for income and food. Chickens, rabbits, goats, cattle, all killed. Some animals died from direct dioxin exposure. Others were slaughtered preventively because they'd been exposed and their meat was unsafe. The carcasses had to be carefully disposed of. They were toxic waste now. For farming families, this was economic devastation on top of health crisis. Your animals dead. Your land contaminated. Your livelihood destroyed. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Seveso response involved pregnant women. Effects on pregnant women were of particular concern. Since dioxins had been shown in laboratory experiments to be teratogenic in mice, and were suspected of having increased the incidence of spontaneous abortions and birth defects in rural Vietnamese populations exposed to herbicides. Dioxin causes birth defects. Animal studies proved it. Evidence from Vietnam suggested it. No one knew the safe exposure level. Maybe there wasn't one. Pregnant women were evacuated from the entire contaminated area, and the Italian government, despite opposition from the Vatican, gave permission for women from the Seveso area to obtain therapeutic abortions. This was 1976 Italy, a deeply Catholic country where abortion was illegal. But the government made an exception for Seveso. 26 pregnant women who had been exposed to the release had abortions. 26 women faced an impossible choice. Give birth to a child who might be severely disabled or dead, or terminate the pregnancy. These weren't therapeutic in the medical sense. Many women weren't sick. Their fetuses had been exposed to dioxin, and no one knew what that meant. Some women chose abortion. Others chose to continue their pregnancies, accepting the risk. The church condemned the abortions. Pro-life groups protested. But these women were making decisions about their own bodies under circumstances no one should face. Even then, the government was saddled with the responsibility of determining the boundaries of the evacuation area, and thereafter to organize the evacuation. This constituted a major imposition on the community as well as on government resources. The response was slow, chaotic, insufficient. It was soon recognized that the factory's very rudimentary safety systems had been designed with little more than simple explosion prevention in mind. Environmental protection had not been considered, nor had any consideration been given to setting up any type of warning system or health protection protocols for the local community. The plant had no emergency plan for dioxin release, no warning sirens, no evacuation procedures. The community had no idea they lived next to a facility producing one of the most toxic chemicals ever made. As a result, the local population was caught unaware when the accident happened and thus was unprepared to cope with the danger of an invisible poison. In the weeks and months after the release, visible health effects appeared. Chloracne, the signature symptom of dioxin exposure. Severe, disfiguring acne that can last years. Many chloracne cases were diagnosed in Seveso residents, especially in children. Liver damage. Dioxin accumulates in the liver, causing enzyme changes and damage. Immune suppression. Increased susceptibility to infections. Neurological effects. Headaches, nerve damage, cognitive impacts. But these immediate effects were just the beginning. The real horror of dioxin exposure is what happens over years and decades. A 2001 study confirmed in victims of the disaster that dioxin is carcinogenic to humans and corroborate its association with cardiovascular and endocrine-related effects. In 2009, an update including 5 more years, up to 1996, found an increase in lymphatic and hematopoietic tissue neoplasms and increased breast cancer. Cancer rates in the exposed population are elevated. Not immediately, cancer takes years to develop. But as decades passed, the pattern became clear. Increased lymphomas, increased soft tissue sarcomas, increased breast cancer, possibly other cancers. While it has been established that people from Seveso exposed to TCDD are more susceptible to certain rare cancers, when all types of cancers are grouped into one category, no statistically significant increase has yet been reported in any specific cancer category. The statistics are complicated. Overall cancer rates aren't dramatically elevated, but specific rare cancers are. This makes sense. Dioxin causes specific types of cancer, not all cancers equally. But tell that to the people dying. Tell it to their families. It's only certain cancers is cold comfort when you're the one with lymphoma. TCDD levels were associated with decreased male and female fertility in Seveso. The male children of mothers who were, during pregnancy of those children, exposed to high levels of toxic dioxins due to the Seveso disaster, have been found to have lower than average sperm counts. Read that again. The sons of women who were pregnant during the disaster have lower sperm counts. The poison affected the next generation before they were even born. A 2008 study evaluated whether maternal exposure is associated with modified neonatal thyroid function in the highly exposed population in Seveso, and concluded that environmental contaminants such as dioxins have a long-lasting capability to modify neonatal thyroid function after the initial exposure. Thyroid problems, fertility problems, all in children who weren't even born when the accident happened. The poison reached into the future, damaging people who didn't exist yet. This review aims to describe the Seveso accident, summarize the results of 40 years of research on the health of the Seveso population since the accident, and discuss next stage research on the health of Seveso residents, their children, and grandchildren. We're now studying the grandchildren, 3 generations removed from the accident, born decades after the cloud settled, living in clean environments, but potentially carrying genetic damage inherited from grandparents who breathed dioxin in 1976. This is the true horror of chemicals like dioxin. They don't just poison the exposed individual. They alter DNA. They damage eggs and sperm. They pass consequences to children who never experienced the exposure. How many generations will be affected? We don't know. We're still finding out. Seveso residents are the only dioxin-exposed population for whom blood samples were collected near the time of exposure, enabling a more accurate exposure assessment of absorbed dose. Nearly 30,000 blood samples were stored. This allowed unprecedented long-term study. In 1987, 11 years after the Seveso accident, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, developed an analytical method using high-resolution gas chromatography/high-resolution mass spectrometry to measure TCDD concentration in human serum. With stored samples and new testing methods, researchers could correlate individual exposure levels with health outcomes decades later. The Seveso population became, tragically, the most thoroughly studied dioxin-exposed group in history. Much of what we know and can learn about the risks of dioxin exposure on human health arose from the tragic circumstances of Seveso. Every paper on dioxin health effects references Seveso. Every risk assessment uses Seveso data. The people of Seveso paid with their health to generate knowledge that protects others. Cleaning up dioxin is nearly impossible. It doesn't break down, persists in soil for decades, can't be washed away, it binds to organic matter. The most contaminated soil had to be removed entirely, scraped up, transported, stored. But where? Dioxin-contaminated soil is hazardous waste that remains hazardous essentially forever. Treatment of the soil in the affected areas is now considered complete since the dioxin levels are now below background. The entire site has been turned into a public park known as Seveso Oak Forest Park. This area is permanently off-limits to development. There are 2 artificial hills in the park. Today, underneath these hills are the toxic remnants, including destroyed houses, tons of contaminated soil, and animal remains, all protected in a concrete sarcophagus. Investigations into site conditions have confirmed that the sarcophagus life expectancy of 300 years is expected, appropriate, and required. 300 years. The concrete tomb holding Seveso's contaminated soil needs to last 3 centuries. That's how long the dioxin remains dangerous. Houses were demolished and buried. An entire community erased and entombed under artificial hills in a park. The landscape itself became a monument to industrial disaster. The Seveso disaster transformed European environmental regulation. It was too big, too visible, too damaging to ignore or minimize. The European Economic Community, precursor to the EU, passed the Seveso Directive in 1982, requiring industrial facilities to identify major accident hazards, emergency planning and preparation, information sharing with communities, regular safety inspections, strict liability for industrial accidents. The directive has been updated multiple times. Seveso 2, Seveso 3, each iteration strengthening requirements. Modern European chemical safety regulations trace their lineage directly to the poison cloud of 1976. But no amount of regulation brings back the victims. No directive undoes genetic damage or cures cancer. Hoffmann-La Roche eventually paid compensation to victims. But the amounts were relatively modest given the scale of damage. And crucially, no one went to prison. Company officials knew the risks of dioxin production. They knew the plant's safety systems were inadequate. They delayed warning the public for a week. Yet criminal prosecution was limited and ultimately unsuccessful. This pattern repeats in industrial disasters. Companies pay fines, victims receive modest compensation, but individuals responsible face minimal consequences. The corporate veil protects executives from accountability for decisions that kill and maim. Research on Seveso continues. This review aims to describe the Seveso accident, summarize the results of 40 years of research on the health of the Seveso population since the accident, and discuss next-stage research on the health of Seveso residents, their children, and grandchildren. Studies are examining cancer rates in the exposed population, still elevated, reproductive health in children and grandchildren, cardiovascular disease, diabetes and metabolic disorders, neurocognitive effects, genetic and epigenetic changes passed to descendants. Every year brings new findings. Every study reveals more about what dioxin does to human bodies and human genes across generations. The people of Seveso didn't choose to be research subjects, but their poisoning provides data that protects others from similar exposures. It's a terrible trade, your health for knowledge that might prevent future disasters. Could Seveso happen again? The regulatory framework is stronger now. Chemical plants have better safety systems, emergency plans, monitoring. Communities have right-to-know laws, but chemical accidents still happen. Bhopal, Tianjin, Beirut. Industrial disasters continue, often in countries with weaker regulations, killing and poisoning thousands. And the chemicals we produce keep getting more complex, more persistent, more dangerous. We create new substances faster than we can understand their long-term effects. PFAS, microplastics, novel pesticides. We're conducting experiments on public health in real time. Seveso should have taught us to be more careful. Instead, we've simply gotten better at managing disasters after they happen. On July 10, 1976, at 12:37 p.m., a safety valve blew at a chemical plant in northern Italy. 6 tons of chemicals, including approximately 15 to 30 kilograms of TCDD, blasted into the atmosphere and settled over 18 square kilometers of populated area. This incident affected a densely populated area, exposing about 5,900 residents, including many children. No human deaths were attributed to TCDD, but many individuals fell ill. But no deaths is misleading. People are still dying from Seveso. Cancer kills slowly. The death toll continues rising decades after the clouds settled. Dioxin is a known human carcinogen and potent endocrine disruptor. It is highly lipophilic and has a long half-life in humans. This is why Seveso matters. This is why we're still studying it 48 years later. Because dioxin doesn't leave. It stays in bodies, in soil, in the environment. It damages DNA and passes that damage to children and grandchildren. The concrete sarcophagus holding Seveso's contaminated soil has a life expectancy of 300 years. 3 centuries from now, our descendants will still be maintaining the tomb of this disaster. Much of what we know and can learn about the risks of dioxin exposure on human health arose from the tragic circumstances of Seveso. Every chemical safety regulation in Europe traces back to Seveso. Every dioxin risk assessment uses Seveso data. Every environmental health study on persistent organic pollutants references Seveso. The people of Seveso paid for that knowledge with their health, their children's health, their grandchildren's health. They became involuntary research subjects in humanity's ongoing experiment with industrial chemicals. Seveso wasn't the first industrial disaster. It won't be the last. As long as we produce dangerous chemicals in populated areas, as long as profit takes priority over safety, As long as communities trust companies to protect them, disasters will happen. The poison cloud of 1976 changed Europe's regulations. But it didn't change the fundamental calculus. Companies make chemicals, communities bear the risk, and when accidents happen, victims get modest compensation while executives face minimal consequences. The long-term damage from the dioxin contamination can still only be estimated. We're still counting, still studying, still discovering new effects decades later. The full cost of Seveso remains unknown because the poison is still working, still damaging, still passing through generations. On a summer Saturday in 1976, a white cloud drifted over an Italian town. It looked harmless. It was death. And 48 years later, it's still killing.